Hi, this is Chris, and I support the Comics Alternative on Patreon. Thank you, Derek and Andy.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 180, a publisher spotlight on AfterShock Comics. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to be doing another publisher spotlight. This one is on AfterShock Comics. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off of the cover price, sometimes they'll be at 50% off cover, but often you'll find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of where you get multiple comics from the same publisher for a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those individually. And this month they have multiple bundles from Marvel and DC, including DC Vertigo and Valiant, but also, apropos of today's topic, they have a bundle from AfterShock, where if you buy the 3 AfterShock comics from March, Rough Riders 2, Jackpot 2, and Black Eyed Kids 2, you get 45% off those comics. So that's a good deal.
That's right. Big discounts there. And of course, you get big discounts all the time at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And Andy, with the AfterShock Publisher Spotlight, we're going to be talking about quite a number of series, so there's a lot for us to discuss. Mm-hmm. So our listeners should sit back with a cup of hot, steaming caffeine, and I know just the place where they can get that caffeine.
Tell us.
It's Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates, and they're a sponsor of the Comics Alternative. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. What's more, every single thing is roasted to order. They do everything in small batches. There's no mass production whatsoever.
That's right, and if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, and you place an order, you can put in a coupon code for comics and get 10% off your order.
That's right. When you use that coupon code, you'll get 10% off. We get a little bit from Just Coffee Co-op, and Just Coffee Co-op makes another sale, so it's a win-win-win situation. That's justcoffee.coop, a great place to get caffeinated. Andy, before we get into this conversation about the 7 new, I guess relatively new, AfterShock titles that are out, we want to remind everyone that we're still doing this survey we've been talking about over the past several weeks. We'd like to hear from all of our listeners to find out a little bit about you guys, just a few small, short demographic questions. 6 questions. That's it. It'll take you only a minute to fill out this survey. If you go to survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative, that's survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comicsalternative. Take a minute, fill out the very quick survey, And if you enter your email address, then your name will be entered into a drawing to receive an official Comics Alternative t-shirt when we get them printed up later this year.
Yep.
So again, survey.libsyn.com/comics alternative. In fact, as you're listening to this podcast, if you're not driving, you can go to this website, take the survey, and you can still pay attention to the great comics talk we're about to commence.
That's right.
So speaking of commencing, let's go ahead and get started, Andy, because we have 7 titles from AfterShock Comics: Super Zero, Replica, InSext, Dreaming Eagles, Strayer, American Monster, and Second Sight that we have so far. Now, AfterShock is relatively new. They just began publishing comics beginning in December of last year. So it's almost as if we're in on the ground floor here, and we wanted to do a publisher spotlight on AfterShock before they put out too many more titles, which would be a little unwieldy for us.
Yeah, that's right. And they have a handful of titles that are already showing up in previews that we didn't get review copies of. That includes Jackpot, Black Eyed Kids, and what was the other one? Rough Riders. Shouldn't have forgotten that. Yeah. So
I know why you forgot that one.
Why?
Because that has a steampunkish feel to it.
Yeah, but it's got Teddy Roosevelt in it, and I've got a soft spot for Teddy Roosevelt, having grown up in North Dakota and having had Teddy Roosevelt shoved down my throat for most of my high school history education, since he lived in western North Dakota.
So we have 3 more titles to come. We have 7 titles that are already out. And in many ways, Andy, we're doing with AfterShock what we did a few years ago with Valiant. You know, when Valiant came back from the dead, so to speak, they had I guess they did something similar. They did new titles. They kind of staggered them out over the first several months of coming back. And we did a publisher spotlight on them before they started to publish too many new titles.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the big differences here, of course, is that Valiant was creating a coherent superhero universe, whereas AfterShock is a series of creator-owned titles. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so that's something I wanted to mention first, was getting a sense of what AfterShock is, and the AfterShock team, I guess the executive team behind it includes, probably at the forefront, Mike Martz, who was an editor at both Marvel and DC for a while, and did the Batman line and the X-Men line, and then Joe Pruitt is the publisher, who is not both a writer and an editor and a publisher. He founded Desperado Publishing, which released their stuff through Image and IDW. Mm-hmm. So these two are the kind of comics guys at the forefront of AfterShock, and then kind of on the board also seems to be a group of people from Hollywood that have backgrounds in development and production, and so while a company like Valiant would have had a clear kind of reason for existence in terms of its superhero universe and the properties that it was using and relaunching, AfterShock has less of a kind of coherency to it. in terms of the number or the different types of series, but it does seem to be largely geared towards comic properties that might serve as intellectual properties and have a life of their own outside of comics.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned those Hollywood executives who are on the board of AfterShock. There's Lee Kramer, who is the president, and he is someone from film. And then there's John Kramer, who's the chief executive officer. And they may be, I guess they're related, I'm not sure. But he's described as an entertainment entrepreneur. And getting back to something else that you said, the fact that all of the titles that we have so far are distinct and not connected one with the other, as we have, let's say, with Valiant, right, where we have a coherent universe with them. Any one of these titles, it seems, would be fair game for television or film adaptation. And in reading some of these, I can't help but feel that that's what the creators are going for here. And this is something that we've discussed before in terms of Vertigo, that this seems to be a direction from a couple things that you've heard. I know you've mentioned this before, in some kind of somewhat inside way that we won't get into the detail here. But that the things that are coming out of Vertigo in some ways are also created with an eye on Hollywood.
Yeah, and I feel like with several of these series, at least, I can see the high concept pitch that would go out for them, and that may be something we can talk about as we talk about each series.
Exactly. Well, let's start with Super Zero, and we've decided that we want to look at these titles in the order in which they were released, at least by month. So for beginning in December of 2015, AfterShock put out Super Zero issue number 1s of Super Zero, Replica, InSext, and Dreaming Eagles. And then in January of this year, they put out number 1 issues of Strayer and American Monster. And then last month, February, we had issue number 1 of Second Sight. So that's roughly the order that we're going to go in. So again, beginning with Super Zero, this is written by Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti, with art by Rafael de la Torre. This is an interesting take on the superhero genre, and this is the closest that an AfterShock title gets to superheroes. Right. Whereas we were talking about Valiant, and what they're doing is very superhero-ish. Maybe not completely superhero in the way that, or at least all their titles aren't completely superhero in the way that we have with the big two. There's still that bent. You don't have it here with the AfterShock titles, but this taps into the superhero genre. And I think that this is an interesting premise in that we have a young schoolgirl, Drew, DRU, who dreams of becoming special. She wants to be a hero, a superhero, and is going through, over the first 3 issues that we have so far, or trying to go through experiences that, according to American comic book history, have created superheroes. So in the very first issue, we have her going to a homeless man and giving him a gun and a few other things, and asking him to meet her parents after they exit a theater, I think the following evening, and to try to rob them, and then that would make her, she reasons, a superhero, kind of like Batman.
Right.
And then in issue number 2, when the first plan fails, she is trying to get her friend to get spiders for her after she gets beat up at school, and then her friend will slip her the spiders as the ambulance is taking her to the hospital. And when she's getting x-rays for concussion, she'll put the spiders underneath the x-ray machine, get bitten by it, and then become a superhero like Peter Parker. And so she goes through a series of these attempts. And I think of all of the titles that we have so far from AfterShock, Super Zero is what I would call the most innocent. I would even use the word charming. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I like Super Zero. I like what it's attempting to do. What are your thoughts on this title?
Well, I like the premise, and I think you described it really well there. This idea of a young girl who's kind of an outcast in her school. She's been left behind grade-wise twice, and it's not because she's not smart, but because she seems largely distracted by a lot of other things. And and she dreams of being a superhero. And goes through then all those conventions of becoming a superhero. I like that idea. I was not bowled over, however, with the execution of it. And this is one that I didn't get through all 3 issues, I have to say, because I just I didn't have the same reaction that you did.
Yeah, you weren't feeling it?
I wasn't feeling it. And the 2 things I wasn't feeling about it is, one, this is a book that I wish had an editor on it, in terms of, I mean, Mike Martz is the editor, but there's so much text in this book that it does feel really overwritten. It doesn't feel like it needs to have that much. We're getting the information we need otherwise, and the text gets kind of repetitive. My second issue with this series is the art. The art seems to be done on a computer, especially the backgrounds. And in looking at a lot of these scenes, this is a problem I have with a lot of art that's done on computer, or that especially does kind of coloring and backgrounds this way, is that it doesn't feel to me like the characters inhabit the world that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
Because that the backgrounds especially don't seem to match the characters or the style of the characters. It doesn't seem to be that their feet are, lined up with the ground at times and things like that. So, that combination of those 2 things kind of took me out of the book. Even though, like I said, I do think this is an interesting premise.
Yeah, 3 things that you mentioned there is worth looking at a little deeper. Because I wanted to comment on those as well. When it comes to the art, I got a feeling that most of the titles that we're going to be discussing on this Publisher Spotlight also have this same feel to it, this computer-generated feel. And not only in terms of the background, but also, the text, the word bubbles. I don't want to describe it as having a sterile feeling, because that's not correct. But there's something about it that, while not completely off-putting to me, makes me pause for a minute to wonder about the art. And in that way, it does take me out of the story, which is, I guess, an experience that you were revealing. Mm-hmm. So I can see where you're coming from here, but I also see this in an issue with some of the other titles that we're going to be discussing. The other thing about the text heaviness of this, I agree. I think that compared to all of the other titles that we're going to be looking at this week, this seems to be the most text heavy. Now, I didn't have a problem with that. Could it have been cut down or edited a bit? Perhaps. Would it have made it a stronger first 3 issues? Maybe. I don't know. Ultimately, I didn't have a problem with the amount of text in here, because there is a lot of story packed in. Especially, I think the dialogue does a lot of the work here. Now, the third thing that you pointed out that was linked to the text heaviness of this first issue is the editing. And this is something that I think we can bring to a discussion of some of these other titles as well. There are a couple that didn't bowl me over or didn't win me over, and I think the fault may be in the editing. Maybe not so much the writing, or if it is in the writing, it's something that an editor could have taken care of, could have pulled the author in, or to work with the author into making things a little more cohesive. Now, you're saying with Super Zero, cutting back on the text could have been handled with a more of a hands-on editor. This gets us back to something that we were mentioning at the outset, and that is the executive team behind AfterShock. You know, with both Mike Martz and Joe Pruitt having a background in editing, I mean, it seems from everything I've seen, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting here with the executive work behind AfterShock. And so I do wonder how much hands-on editing goes on with the individual titles here.
Yeah, but you know, this is also something I have noticed with other work that Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor have collaborated on. They happen to jam an enormous amount of text into the comic. Now, with a series like Supergirl, it didn't, or not Supergirl, excuse me, Starfire, it didn't bother me that much because I kind of liked the running monologue that character had throughout, you know, the internal monologue that character had throughout the book. But I felt like that there were times when it isn't that I would say, you know, I would go into Super Zero and say, you know, cut 30% of the text that's in here. It's that when we kind of know what's going on and it gets repetitive of that, you know, of kind of repeating the premise.
Yeah. Okay. Now that is a good point. I did read all three of the issues that we have of Super Zero, and my main criticism of Super Zero so far is that, and I guess this is at the writers here, Palmiotti and Connors, that they need to reduce the repetition according to the premise, as you point out, and to start exploring other possibilities that they've already embedded within this narrative so far. With these first three issues, it's almost as if we have a repetition of the same thing, where we have Drew attempting some, you know, outlandish scheme that will, you know, make her a superhero in some way, and in many ways this kind of taps into, you know, the superhero history when it comes to American comics. And then that fails, then it's on to Plan B, and then Plan C, and then probably Plan D. And so we have the same thing with issue 1, issue 2, issue 3. But one of the things I think that has a lot of potential with Super Zero, the various relationships, or the potential for the relationships that we have between Drew and other characters. Because as we, and these are all in this first issue, there is a character named Kevin who has a crush on Drew, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. They tease that, I think, a little bit in issue number 3, but there's not much there. I think even more interesting is a friend of Drew's named Tana. She has a very troublesome relationship at home. And I think that there's a lot of dramatic potential for that story as well. Another potential narrative angle is Drew's relationship with her principal, who is also her neighbor.
Right.
And we get that in the opening pages of issue number 1 of Super Zero. So there are many directions that I think that Connors and Palmiotti can go here. And I hope that we don't have the rest of this series just playing out and milking the premise for everything that it's worth. Although I do have to say there is something fun, lighthearted fun, I guess, about the way that they're playing with the superhero genre. It's almost as if, it's not as if, I mean, they are insiders to the industry, and so you get a lot of inside commentary, inside jokes. It reminds me of that very first issue that they did of Harley Quinn a few years ago, because it seemed to be a series of inside jokes, especially when it comes to the art in comics. I think there's some of that same humor coming out here in Super Zero, but after a while, after I got into and then past issue number 2, okay, quit giving me the inside jokes, quit playing on the premise, let's get to other aspects of what this story can actually do.
Yeah, you know, one of the things you said there, I kind of saw that when I was reading it and then scanning through the other issues was how I can see, a kind of writer's outline or structure that makes sense. She tries Batman's origin, she tries Spider-Man's origin, so on. That you could structure each issue around a different, superhero convention or origin. I did think that one of the more charming things about it, though, was a lot of the inside stuff. Like very early on in issue 1, when she's she's buying lunch for the homeless man that she's hiring to mug her parents. She talks about this kind of theory of heroism, I guess it is, that that all these different religions and so on and sources of mythology are piecing together into something that they each have a piece of some kind of puzzle that would reveal the true hero or something like that. And while religions have parts of this puzzle, the biggest parts of the puzzle come from superheroes, and that her theory is that superhero creators, as she said, are drawn to creating superheroes, and they can't help it. It's in their blood. They write and draw these stories, even though the job holds no security, has no health coverage, no retirement plan, and for the most part alienates them from normal society. Honestly, most of them can make more money packing bags in a supermarket, but they don't. There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. When I came across that, I thought that was sadly true, but a kind of interesting commentary on the comics industry, especially mainstream superheroes.
Yeah, you're right to point out that, and I think this is where much, if not most, of the text heaviness comes into play. These opening pages of Super Zero #1. Once we get past the credits, we have a series of, I guess you could call them voiceovers, in other words, or interior monologues, where we have Drew, and what she is telling us is quite philosophical. I mean, this is heavy stuff. And then she meets the homeless guy and begins to explain to him her theories, which you were just quoting from. And again, we get more of that heavy philosophical stuff. That's also, I think, Connor's and Palmiotti's awareness of the state of the industry at the same time. So there's a lot going on here in these several opening pages. But then after this point, there seems to be almost a disconnect between what's played out and these higher theories that Drew espouses in the opening pages.
Right.
Yeah. I hope we get back to those at some point, and that those aren't just a way to introduce the character of Drew and then we let those ideas lie.
Right.
Yeah. So I think this has a lot of potential. I'm looking forward to seeing what the creators can do with this title and how long it'll go on. I think that this has the possibility to be an interesting ongoing series. I just don't know how long it'll last if they keep focusing on the premise and don't get much beyond it quickly.
Yeah, but when you think about like a lot of the TV series, for example, that recent superhero series, like Green Arrow and Supergirl and The Flash, each one of them has kind of started out with the character having a list of things to do, right? Like Green Arrow had a list of the people who are, that from his father who are ruining Star City, or Starling City, and he has to go, stop each one of them. And those shows follow that list for a few episodes to kind of set the premise and then get into more of the kind of character-driven stuff. That may be where Super Zero, is going. What I wonder is there, if Drew does get powers at some point, or does somehow become a costumed hero, what's left for the series to do after that.
Right. I mean, I can't see her becoming powered in any way, because I think it will take this title off into a completely different direction.
Right.
Now, I mean, it could work. It's just, I guess it's more me wanting this to be anchored more in realism,
right,
than something that's, a little more generic, fantastical. So, yeah, I'm curious to see where this will go.
Right.
So the next title we're going to be looking at is Replica. This is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Andy Clark, and we have 4 issues of this that have come out. Now, we were talking about Super Zero as a more realistic narrative. Definitely not the case with Replica.
No. So with this series, by Paul Jenkins with art by Andy Clark, has is definitely in the science fiction genre, and it's got a pretty complicated world that the story takes place in. But basically, we follow a detective by the name of Trevor Churchill, who works on, I guess it's a planet, though it seems to be a largely artificial planet, called the Transfer, and this place is kind of at the epicenter, as it says, of the known universe, and so it intersects with all these different
races,
systems, systems and races that all have a piece of it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And Trevor is the kind of a police officer within the human district,
right?
Well, as there's all these other kind of alien races that have their own districts, and those districts are fairly autonomous. And so there's a complex set of rules that govern the transfer, and the politics of such a place are kind of a part of the story we get. But basically, the plot of this first arc is that Trevor, as a cop, has picked up the murder of an ambassador on the eve of a peace treaty being signed by the ambassador's race and another group, I believe called Scarlet, or the Scarlet.
Right.
And in the meantime, Trevor, who feels overworked, his partner is highly unreliable in a lot of ways. There's a lot of communication problems between him and other police officers as well, and he decides to get himself cloned to help him with his workload, but something goes wrong and he ends up with 50 clones.
Yeah.
Or 49 clones in himself.
Yeah.
And then each one of these clones then develops a separate personality. And so go ahead.
Right, no, and each of those personalities is supposedly a facet of his own, of Trevor's identity. So there's some of the characters, or some of the clones that we see in the first few issues. There's one who, I guess they're called by number, right? So right. Trevor is Trevor, but after that, the clones, at least according to Trevor, go by numbers. And so there's number 2, who actually wants to be called Roger. Right. But number 2 seems to be the most organized and methodical. In other words, he's the one who gets all of the grunt work because he can do it. He's efficient. He is reliable. And then the other clones, we see quite a bit of this almost Sherlock Holmes detective kind of character. There is another clone that is very technically savvy. There's another clone, I think maybe this is number 3, that's a stoner. Right. Who ends up causing some problems. And so each of these clones is supposedly a part of Trevor's own personality, and so he at times he can't imagine him, this part of himself being cloned out. and that part of himself becomes, an entire individual that's defined by that characteristic. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential here, especially humor potential in this title. Now, you mentioned the setup of this as a sci-fi narrative, the everything taking place on the transfer, which is at the epicenter of the universe. The way it's described is that it floats inside 1,000 points of folded space. And the first issue of Replica is interesting in that I think that Jenkins does a pretty good job of setting everything up quickly and then getting on with what will appear to be the first story in, I guess, this first narrative arc, or the story in this first narrative arc. Because in the opening few pages, we get some case that Trevor's on, and of course it kind of goes screwy. But then there's this one page that does give us the premise, which is all about the transfer, which you alluded to. And then after we have that page, then we get to this first case, and him cloning himself. Now, it struck me reading this first issue that the idea of cloning himself is more of an afterthought than anything. And in fact, he is with his lieutenant, which is this kind of oaf-type character named Vorgus. And I think of all of the characters in Replica, he's the one I think that I like the most, just because he is kind of a lovable oaf. But Trevor and Vorgus are passing a billboard for a company called, I think this is what the company's called, U2, YOOTOO, where you can get, according to this billboard, 50% off of your purchase of additional clones. And so he goes in to get a clone, but he ends up, getting much more than he bargained for. But it seemed like almost an afterthought. And in that way, it struck me in this first issue as maybe a tad clunky in order to get to the clone part. I mean, I like this first issue. The fact that he got cloned and he got more clones than he wanted seemed to be, I don't know, a little too overt for me to set up this premise. But then once we got past that first issue, I think that Trevor's relationship with his own clones in the issues to follow, that was really interesting.
Yeah, and so this is a book I kind of feel like after reading those first 4 issues that that may have functioned better in a trade. Because once I did also feel like the first issue was a little clunky, especially I'm just personally kind of averse to the kind of science fiction stories that hit you with all of these, I don't know, this alien or this futuristic jargon and language and, like new swear words, for example. Even though I loved Battlestar Galactica, I got really tired of frack all the time and just like, say it. Just say it. And they do that here on page 1. Trevor says "shud," SHUDD. So that's, I don't know. And then, but anyway,
actually, now Shud's a character though.
Oh, okay, you're right.
Shud and Veetbot.
Yeah, I thought he was swearing there when I first read it.
Well, it looks like a cuss word.
Yeah. So anyway, But anyway, there's a load of this kind of jargon right away, and names of alien races that are just kind of thrown at you. And normally, I would have, said enough of that after the first few pages. But this is a series I'm really glad I stuck with those first 4 issues, because I think it does get better as it goes along. The humor qualities that you talk about with the potential with the different clones, I think works really well. We haven't even seen all the clones yet, but we know some of them, and number 2 being one of the most prominent, but also number 4, who's the one you described as in the Sherlock Holmes type outfit, who is perhaps the most perfect of all the clones, and the one that all the other clones love him the most, and so even more than they love Trevor. And a psychiatrist even says to Trevor, in discussing this situation with the psychiatrist, or they reference that there might be a massive Oedipal complex going on with all the 49 other clones, and Trevor kind of resists the idea that they're all aspects of his personality, but one of the things the psychiatrist explains is that they're all aspects of his personality, but also ways in which he would respond to the lack of identity one would experience if one were a clone. Right? So one of the clones is a compulsive eater. Another one kind of has a death wish. Is
that number 12, who's like the Rambo type character?
Yeah, well, yeah, and he has an interesting story, I guess, within this issue or within the series. But number 38 is kind of like a James Bond type spy, and then, like you said, number 3 is a stoner. So these are all a variety of different ways in which these clones are trying to make themselves feel like coherent individuals, and I like that idea.
Yeah. I don't want to sell issue number 1 of Replica short. I think it does what it needs to do to set everything up, maybe a little awkwardly, but I think once you get past that first issue, then this series becomes more fun. Right.
And what this series really reminded me of is two things. One, it reminded me of it could have been a great 2000 AD serial. It has that feeling of the world building that would go on in a series from there, and I really like Andy Clark's art, but Andy Clark's art tends towards the realistic, and I wonder if and I like the way he imagines some of these aliens. There's some really crazy looking aliens. I just wonder if a more kind of surreal 2000 AD type artist what they would have done with it. The other thing it reminds me of, and this is mainly with the Planet the Transfer. Did you ever read John Ostrander and Tim Truman's series Grimjack?
No, I didn't.
Back in the day? Yeah, so Grimjack was a bounty hunter, basically, but he was on a planet that was a lot like the Transfer, that had these distinct zones. The main difference was with Sinizur, the planet in Grimjack, each of those zones also had different physical laws. So, you could, if you didn't know how to navigate through these different zones, you might be taken by surprise.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that also had a kind of noirish feel to it as well. So the blending of film noir and science fiction reminded me of that, plus the kind of concept of a planet made up of distinct zones with distinct characteristics.
Yeah, when I first started reading Replica, I immediately thought of the Image series, The Fuse, because you have something similar going on. You have some kind of station. I guess we've been calling the Transfer a planet, but we have a station that's also sci-fi, police procedural. So there's something similar going on there. Although I think that with Replica, with the cloning, embedded in the series very title, has much more potential for humor. Definitely than The Fuse.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, this is one that I want to continue reading and see where it goes.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Yeah. So the third title that we're going to be discussing, it also had its first issue in December of last year, and that is Marguerite Bennett and Ariella Cristantina's InSext, and that is InSexts. And we have 4 issues of that so far. I know that when you and I began talking before we started recording, we were comparing what we thought were the strongest series so far and which we liked the least. And I think you and I are at different ends of the spectrum with InSexts.
Yeah, that's true. I actually, of the series we've read, and I think we only got 2 issues of InSexts, but I think more have come out. This is the series I like the best out of all of AfterShock's books, and I know you had the opposite reaction, but basically it is, and this is going to probably come as a surprise to people because someone might incorrectly refer to InSext as a steampunk story.
I hadn't thought of it as that, but you know,
it is set in Victorian England,
right?
And then the 1890s, and we have basically kind of two main characters. Lady Bertram, who is in a very unhappy arranged marriage with her husband, and the family is kind of desperate for her to produce an heir. But Lady Bertram has a servant named Mariah who is, again, not necessarily all that she seems to be, and she and Lady Bertram become lovers, and
or they are lovers by the time the story begins.
Are they? That's one thing I wasn't kind of clear about, if that's there from the beginning, or if we're seeing kind of the very beginning of their connection. I may be wrong about that.
And maybe I'm assuming too much. And that's the way I read it. And I mean, go ahead and finish what you were mentioning, because I want to use this confusion as a springboard to one of my problems with this title.
Well, it moves very quickly at the beginning. And the reason why I kind of see this is that one of the first things we see happen is that Lady Bertram gets, I guess, stung by an insect. And that, I was guessing, is the kind of origin of her becoming a human insect hybrid. And then she and Mariah, hook up at this point, and I was kind of guessing that this might be the first time they've done this, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But whatever the case is, that this is where we see that Mariah herself is also not entirely human, and so she helps Lady Bertram produce an heir in a very unconventional way.
Right.
and so that begins the basically kind of the intrigue that follows. They and I don't know how much more to say about the series without revealing too much, but basically you have this Victorian setting, Victorian kind of upper class household, in which the lady of the house and one of her servants share this secret, and it seems to be that all the other servants also know about at least some part of the secret, and they are helping to assist in the and covering it up.
Right. Okay, a couple of things that you mentioned that is set up not just in the first issue, but in the opening pages of issue number 1. And we're reading some of this differently. For instance, at the very beginning, we see a relationship between Lady Bertram and Mariah, and you think that this is where things may begin. I read this that they already had a relationship in process by the time we get to the first page of this comic. Another thing is when Lady Bertram is bitten by this insect, or she swats the insect, and we see her saying "ew," because she has the goo, the insect goo on her fingers. That this is what sets things in motion to make her a human insect. I just assumed that her and Mariah's human insectness is already there, that as coincidence would, as fate would have it, she swats an insect, and that's the way that we're led into this story. Now, I think either my reading that this stuff is already going on by the time we enter this narrative, and yours that this is where things actually begin in these opening pages, I think both of them are viable, but herein lies my problem with InSext, and that is, in reading this, I feel that I'm on the periphery of understanding what the hell is going on. I have a sense of things, but I don't completely understand what Bennett is attempting to say here. Now, I think the strongest thing about InSext is the art. I think Kristen Tina's art is fabulous. And in fact, I think that it's the art that's going to draw a lot of male readers because, how should we put this? This is quite an erotic title in places, and but outside of the eroticism, it is beautiful art, and I think that that's the strong suit of this title. But when it comes to Bennett's writing, there are just a lot of holes and things that aren't filled in, information that is sketchy in places. And this gets back to an earlier comment that you were making about Super Zero, about the editing. I think this is where a very good editor could come into play and to make InSext a very good title. So, for instance, the fact that my reading of the opening is very different from yours tells us something about the gaps in the writing. Other gaps, at what point did you realize that Lady Bertram was Indian? And why that might be significant, or maybe not significant?
That comes up in the second issue, right?
Right. Now, if that's a point worth bringing up in issue number 1, if it's going to be a somewhat important plot point, then why does it seem to get buried and mentioned almost in passing at one point in issue number 2? My point is here that there's a lot of great potential in InSexts. It's just there's not enough that's explained. So, for instance, we're already into 4 issues of InSexts, and I still am unclear, what is this human insect thing? And who is the London Butcher, and what kind of role does he play? Now, my assumption is many of these questions will be answered after this first narrative arc, but I think 4 issues in, I still have these questions. I just feel like I'm still at the point of trying to understand this story, but I would think that by issue 4, I should be able to understand by this point. And I don't completely. So I think that my problem with this series is in the writing, and this is where, again, a strong editor could really make this a better title.
For one thing, I only got 2 issues. So did you get 4?
Yeah, I've read all 4.
Okay. I only received the advanced copies of 2 of them, so I'm not as far into the series as you are. I don't see these things that you're bringing up as being necessarily problems with the series. The opening, the way I read the opening was that we're kind of launched into a relationship between these two that hasn't become intimate yet, but when when Lady Bertram sees how Mariah's been abused by Lord Bertram. They kind of share a moment together, and then they become lovers. Again, I may be wrong about that, but then while they're in later on in that first issue, while they're in bed together, the Mariah kind of explains a little bit about how this, Lady Bertram asks, where did it come from? And Mariah explains a little bit. I knew a woman, a lady's maid, and an officer's wife in Burma. He never let her be, kept her with child, even when she said too much, too many, and then this is where Lady Bertram kind of feels a connection with that story as well. But we get a hint that that's where the origin of Mariah's situation comes from. And then, and then the rest of it, I mean, I'm fine with the way this series paces out its information. We also don't meet until the second issue, Lord Bertram's brother and wife, who are going to have a significant kind of impact on this, because they don't believe the story about what has been happening in this house. And so it's kind of pacing out its information in a very slow way that I don't necessarily mind. My other thing with it too that I like is I really like this premise in general, because when we talked about these series coming out when they first appeared in previews, one of my responses about the description of InSext was that it reminded me of A.S. Byatt's novella Angels and Insects. And in reading the series, the parts that I've read so far, it even seems more influenced by that, maybe. Though Angels and Insects is not a supernatural story, it is about a family that a wealthy aristocratic family that has a secret, and the servant's job, it seems to be, to kind of run the house and keep others from finding out about that family secret, and so the metaphor of the insects kind of functioning in there is these kind of drones that are at work to keep the otherwise useless wealthy family going, is at work there, and so I'm seeing that play out here as well.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I do see a lot of potential here. My issue with what I've seen in the first 4 issues of InSext is that there's still just a lot of gaps. There are things that aren't explained, and it's almost as if Bennett is introducing new wrinkles into the narrative without having explained much of the previous wrinkles. Case in point, and I know you haven't gotten to issue number 4 yet, but without giving anything away, at the very end of issue 4, we find out a new mystery regarding Lady Bertram's sister-in-law that, as you mentioned, we're introduced to in issue number 2. Mm-hmm. And what we learn, there's really no hint of anywhere before this point, and it's almost as if it's kind of thrown at us without any awareness now, or with any teasing. I would have been okay with that had there not been other mysteries that aren't completely explained set up previous. Again, it's gaps in the storytelling that I think good editor with a stronger hand on this title would have been able to fix, saying, okay, let's give a little more exposition here, or let's rework this story to where the reader may get a little bit more of information. I mean, my overall feeling, as I pointed out earlier, is that I just feel on the edge of understanding what's going on. And I guess you're okay with the story as things are unfolding. I'm just not as satisfied.
Yeah. Well, that's why I would take issue with you saying there's something that needs to be fixed here. I don't have a problem with the way the information is unfolding. It is, I like the world that that Bennett and Kristantina have created for this series, and I'm along for it. And so, if they have chosen to kind of have this deliberate pace with the information, I'm fine with it. Now, if we get a year into the series and the trigger hasn't been pulled on some of this stuff, then there may be an issue there. But for right now, I'm really enjoying the world that this comic has created, and I'm along for it.
Yeah. I'd like to be along for it. I just wish that some of those narrative gaps would be filled in.
Yeah, you made that clear. and my response is get over it.
Yeah, okay. Well, something that I think has very few narrative gaps is the next title that we're going to be discussing. And this was the fourth title to be released, the number one issue, in December of last year. And this is Garth Ennis's and Simon Colby's Dreaming Eagles. Now, unless I'm wrong, I think this is the only series so far out of AfterShock that is set as a mini-series. In other words, there is an endpoint. So we have right now 3 issues of what's to be a 6-issue series. And this story, even if you didn't know that this was a limited series, I think the premise, the setup that we get in issue number 1 does suggest to us that there's only so far that this story can go. And I'm fine with that. I think this has much more limited potential than some of the other things we've been discussing so far. In other words, I don't see this as being an ongoing. I don't think it could be. And maybe one of the reasons why I'm saying that is because, Garth Ennis does such a good job with these kind of relatively short in-and-out war stories that I just expect this to be, a relatively short war story, which it seems to be. So here we have a story that opens in, 1966. And we have a character by the name of Reggie who is a middle-aged father. He's looking up in the sky and he's seeing a plane flying overhead. And then he starts talking with his son, and we find out that the relationship between Reggie and his son is not really rocky, but there's some misunderstanding. In other words, we have a generation gap going on here. His son has just finished listening to Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech, and he's very taken by Martin Luther King. Reggie is a little more reserved. He's aware that, yes, there is a race problem, and both of these characters, by the way, we should mention are African American. Reggie is aware that there is definitely a race problem in the United States, but his way of dealing with the race problem is very different from the way that his son thinks that it should be dealt with. And so I think that that small tension there between father and son is set up very nicely here. And what Ennis does is he uses this father-son relationship as a way into Reggie's story, which becomes Dreaming Eagles, because we learned that during World War II, Reggie was part of an all-black Air Corps from the United States, and the first 3 issues is what we have, what Reggie and others went through in terms of training and being, African-American flyers in a military that just didn't respect them.
Yeah, and well, one of the things you said at the beginning there, it's basically was my response to this, which is that Garth Ennis has done these kind of war stories before, and he's really good at them. Mm-hmm. And so, if anybody has read those comics and liked them, then Dreaming Eagles is going to be right up there with those. And I didn't have a greater response kind of beyond that. My reading of it was this is what Garth Ennis does.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that you could come to this and say, well, this is what Garth Ennis does, especially when it comes to war stories. And you'd be right. And this is a very good war story. At least the first 3 issues, I think, are really strong. But I think that it's good writing, period. And I think this tells us, or at least it tells me, I'm sure you're going to disagree, some of the differences between Garth Ennis and a younger writer like Marguerite Bennett. My feeling with Dreaming Eagles is that from the get-go, even if I didn't know who Garth Ennis was, I felt that this was a strong story. Once you know that it's Garth Ennis, that he's been doing this for quite a while, especially within this genre, I mean, he knows what he's doing. With Marguerite Bennett, I got a sense that, she's still learning. I mean, she's done other things, of course. I know, Bombshells at DC, among other things. But there's still not as cohesive a storytelling capabilities as Garth Ennis does. So you can tell he is tried and true here with Dreaming Eagles. And so I think going into this, even though you don't know necessarily what you may be getting, for instance, if you're unaware that Garth Ennis is very adept at war stories, I think from the first several pages you would say that this is a pretty tight story.
Well, yeah, I think that comparison is really unfair. I mean, the burden of world building on Ennis's part in Dreaming Eagles is much, much less than the burden is on Bennett in InSext. She's creating a fairly unfamiliar world in there, whereas we tend to be aware of America in the 1960s and World War II enough.
But there's a lot of world building in Replica, and I think that Paul Jenkins did a very adept job at setting things up in those first few issues. And there are other titles that we're going to be discussing that world building is also, I think, more of a heavy lifting than it is for Garth Ennis with Dreaming Eagles.
Right.
I didn't have the same experience with those. Now, I mean, I don't want to use this as an episode where I keep coming down on Marguerite Bennett. I mean, I do think that, again, InSext has a lot of potential. It's just it hasn't won me over.
Right, but I'm just saying that you were making a comparison between Dreaming Eagles and InSext. You were not making a comparison with those other works. And I was saying that comparison is not fair.
Yeah. And also it's not fair in the fact that Dreaming Eagles is limited. If this weren't a limited 6-issue series, then I do think that you could make a more fair comparison. I mean, I can make the comparison between Paul Jenkins and Marguerite Bennett if you'd like. My main point is that from the very first issue, I think that things are very tightly woven. And for me, at least, it caught my attention. I wanted to go on to read issue number 2 and then issue number 3 of Dreaming Eagles.
Yeah, well, and I actually I didn't, and it's not that I wasn't. Again, like I said, it's not that I didn't find Dreaming Eagles a good story. It was I felt less compelled to want to read more issues of that than I was of pretty much all of the other series, even the ones I really disliked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is interesting. This title, Dreaming Eagles, when we think about one of the things we were discussing last week with that anthology or the Reader visual storytelling, that segment in that collection of the Harlem Hellfighters. Mm-hmm. This is very similar, where we have African Americans fighting in a major world war and the things that they went through in order to do what they wanted to do, which is fight for their country, fight for their dignity. So this is another interesting story in that vein. Another thing I was thinking about. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean but what you bring up there is one of the things that maybe was made it less compelling for me, is that I kind of know I know the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Mm-hmm. So I've seen this story before told in a lot of different places, and the story of any kind of group of African American soldiers in World War II who faced prejudice and so on. That is also, I've also seen that before. So all that is nothing new. I think the one saving grace for me for Ennis was that he does structure this as this kind of flashback, using the context of the civil rights movement in the 1960s to kind of show to contrast that with the era of World War II, where Reggie was making his what would you call it? Kind of groundbreaking, status changing role in this group.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, are you going to go on to read the remaining issues of Dreaming Eagles?
I don't know. They'll be in my pile, I guess. I don't. They may keep moving down the pile just because, again, I keep reading it and feeling like I've seen this.
This is interesting. Before we move on to our next title, which is Strayer, I was just thinking that, in this episode, you and I are disagreeing quite a bit, I think more than usual, when it comes to our appreciation of some of these titles. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing because many times we will get emails and Facebook messages from people who say they like it when we disagree. Because it makes it more of a kind of a Siskel and Ebert kind of thing going on.
Well, that's good that people say that because I was totally, this is going to be my last episode. Just want to let you know. I've metaphorically flipped the table over, and I'm ready to walk out.
Okay. So. Well, before you walk out, let's finish this episode. So this next issue, this next series, the first issue came out in January of this year, and this is Strayer, written by Justin Jordan with art by Juan Gedeon. And now I'm familiar with the work of Justin Jordan,
right.
Not so much the art of Gedeon. Do you know what else Gedeon has done?
No, I'm not. I haven't read anything else.
And this is another fantastical narrative. In other words, something not anchored in reality, which we had with Dreaming Eagles and Super Zero. How to describe this one? The title character is the focus. He is a fighting machine, I guess. He has these devices that look like it's something like thick brass knuckles, even though they're not brass knuckles, that when he puts them on his hand, he can manipulate them into weapons. They take shape like these. It almost looks like they turn into these big swords on his fists. Mm-hmm. He's a very adept fighter. And in this first issue, he meets this woman. What is she called? An archmage?
Yeah.
And apparently, in this world, there are no more archmages. And when others in this world learn that there is still one around, then they go to hunt her down. But now, since Strayer is accompanying her, or at least this archmage is following Strayer, because Strayer's kind of reluctant. He's not a people person, let's say.
Archmancer.
Archmancer, that's it, Archmancer. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Then he gets involved in this drama as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think of this series? Was this one that didn't... One of those that you had mentioned didn't float your boat?
No, actually, I really liked Strayer. I think this captures what the things I like about Justin Jordan's writing when he can combine this kind of like kick-ass action with a lot of humor. Mm-hmm. I mean, the character Strayer is very much in keeping with a lot of other characters that that Justin Jordan writes.
Right.
And so I like
Strode and the spread, yeah.
Yeah, so I like that. I like the humor of the series, and so but at first this series looked like it was maybe a barbarian series. Mm-hmm. That's how kind of the first part of our first introduction to the characters. But the opening does give a little explanation that we're in really a post-apocalyptic world,
right?
And it is pretty much seems to be our world, in the future after this great collapse has occurred, and it's a long ways into the future. But some of the technology from prior to the collapse still exists, and this is the sort of thing that is causing the problems that Strayer and his new partner, what's her name, Mala Tenboom, is are dealing with.
So you see this as our world? Because I thought of this as a completely different alien world.
Okay.
With this opening pages, because of the way that things are set up at the beginning. If we look on the first page, there's this second long panel, and it does look like a skyline that would be somewhat reminiscent of one of our big cities. But the exposition that accompanies the images just tells me otherwise. I don't think that's necessarily important, but it is some kind of post-apocalyptic world that we're in here. And again, it kind of reminds me of what we have with, for instance, The Spread. And I like this, and it is interesting that I thought that this might be one of those titles that you didn't like. And maybe the reason I felt that was because of these 7 titles, the one that I didn't have the highest hopes for, and I don't know why, was Strayer. Because I read the first issue, I liked it, went on to the next, and I was asking myself, once I finished the first issue of Strayer, what was it that I wasn't expecting, or what was it that I was expecting in terms of not liking this? And I can't recall. I don't know. Maybe it was just some kind of weird, psychological fluke. But I think this is an interesting story. I'm wondering. I guess there is a lot of potential here, and so this is, I guess, could be a successful ongoing series.
Yeah, and I think it uses the conventions of fairly typical barbarian type stories, especially the kind of the mismatch between the reluctant hero and the younger person who's trying to hire him to be on the quest with her. That's a pretty standard convention, but I think what Jordan does with it, especially the humor that he instills in this comic, is a lot of fun. And I do like Gideon's art too. It's kind of stripped down, but has really good storytelling.
Yeah, I think of all of the art that we're looking at this week, it's the least detailed. And I don't mean that in a negative way,
right.
But you're right. I think stripped down is a good way of describing it. It's let's say the opposite of what we find in Andy Clark in Replica.
Yeah, exactly. But yet I still think it does a good job of conveying the world that the story is taking place in.
I agree. Before we get to the last 2 titles that we're going to be discussing on this Publisher Spotlight, let's remind our listeners that one of the sponsors of the Comics Alternative is Just Coffee Co-op. Go to their website, justcoffee.coop. That's justcoffee, one word, .coop. They have a lot of different coffees to choose from. Fill up your shopping cart, and before you check out, be sure to use the coupon code COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order. That's justcoffee.coop. So now let's get to the last 2 titles. Coming out in January of this year was also issue number 1 of American Monster, written by Brian Azzarello and art by Juan Doe. Now, Andy, when I said that for some weird reason I wasn't expecting to be bowled over by Strayer, I think the title that I had the highest expectations for of this initial wave from AfterShock was American Monster. And that's because of Brian Azzarello. I love his work. Obviously 100 Bullets comes immediately to mind, but he's done so many other things that I've enjoyed. But knowing that this was, from the title, going to have something to do with crime and, of course, violence. We're talking about Brian Azzarello here. I immediately was thinking 100 bullets. I'm going to like this. And even though I like American Monster, I haven't been bowled over by it yet. Now, we're only 2 issues in. So there's still quite a bit of time for me to really get involved here. I think, though, that you had more of a problem with this series than I did.
Yeah, I feel like I'm hitting the point with Brian Azzarello where I'm not as enamored with his work anymore. I liked 100 Bullets a lot, and but I for example really didn't like his run on Hellblazer, and there's so I guess I can be kind of hit and miss with him. So one of the things I felt, and this is an interesting reaction when I look at Strayer. Strayer is clearly a Justin Jordan book, and it has a lot of the things he does. Well, American Monster is clearly, if you showed this book to me without telling me who the writer was, I could tell you it's a Brian Azzarello book. Mm-hmm. But yet it's got a lot of. It doesn't feel like it has any of the things that I want from a Brian Azzarello, or that I liked about the better Brian Azzarello works, which is, in 100 Bullets we had characters that I felt like I cared about, that I wanted to see succeed or have good things happen to them or whatever, like Izzy, for example. Mm-hmm. And even a character like Lono, is an awful guy, but there's something appealing about him. When I read the first 2 issues of American Monster, I felt like I was done with it. Like I don't want to inhabit this world anymore.
Really?
Yeah. And probably could have checked out at the end of the first issue when the 2 guys have this couple basically tied to chairs in the middle of a field with their arms outstretched and taped to each other, and they have guns pointing at each other, and the 2 guys basically are taking bets on who is going to shoot the other one first. And it's it's a husband and wife. I just found that so I don't know, unnecessarily over the top, that I just did not want to.
So you think this is too gratuitous?
Yeah, it's gratuitous in the way that and I think that the world that this is taking place in is very similar to the America that Azzarello wrote about in his Hellblazer run. Mm-hmm. And I don't feel like there's anything to kind of balance out the ugliness of that scene or some of these characters for me to be interested in wanting to see where the series goes.
Okay, yeah, I can see having a big problem with these 2 characters that you referenced, mm-hmm. Felix and Josh. Them taping the husband and wife's arms together, each with a gun. Yeah, I mean, I can see someone having a problem with this scene. I mean, it obviously sets up these 2 people, Felix and Josh, as characters we hope, meet violent ends of their own. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that, we'll get that soon enough. But we haven't talked at all about who is arguably the main character of this story. And he is a war veteran, I guess, from a Iraqi war, Afghanistan war. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even sure of his name. Is his name even given at any point?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so, but he is this big, tough-looking guy who has obviously had some kind of injury, some skin injury. I mean, it looks like he has no skin, that there's just muscle underneath because he's red. But we know he's not just a complete, literal muscle man because the people around him would be completely repulsed. They don't know what to make of this guy, but but there is something off and different about him, given his experience as a veteran. And you mentioned Lano earlier. There's something about this character who I think is unnamed as of yet. He reminds me of someone that could be a cross between Lano and, let's say, Spaceman. That limited series that Azzarello did with Russo, who also worked with him on 100 Bullets. So, both of these characters are big. Both of them are outsiders. Spaceman was a little more human. Lano, not so much so. And I think that you combine the two and you get whatever this character is that we're just learning about. And even by the end of issue number 2, we still don't know much about what's going on with this guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, except that he's somehow connected to the big crime boss in this small town, wherever it is that's taking place, and because they both have the same SS tattoo on their backs, which there again is another Azzarello's fetishization of Nazi imagery is, when I saw that on the main character's back, I was like, yeah, that's also enough for me.
This will appeal to Trump voters.
Yeah, there you go. They'll see this as a hero. And there's something maybe this. Now when Deputy Downs, who may be one of the only potentially redeeming characters in this book, does confront the large red man in the hotel room. He refers to him as Theodore Montclair.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
But we don't know if that is really his name. But, having a police officer named Downs may be one of the most Brian Azzarello things going on in this book as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's, I almost feel like I'm, someone, when you mentioned Donald Trump, someone accused me of being just too PC to enjoy this book. I don't like that. In one of the first scenes in the first issue, that they make fun of a mentally handicapped person. I don't like seeing a dog shot. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here that just is a world I don't want to inhabit anymore. I guess I've said that already.
Yeah, I can see that. But, the world that Azzarello is mapping out here is, a world that is, all too realistic, unfortunately. A character we haven't mentioned yet, and this is one who I'm expecting to see more of, and this is a young woman, and I think is her name Snow? This is the one we see on the seesaw exposing herself, which sounds weird. And you could argue that even that is gratuitous in the opening pages of American Monster #1. But there's some potential here. And you mentioned Izzy in 100 Bullets, but there's the opportunity to really empathize with that character, where she comes from, and what she's striving for. And I'm wondering if what we have with this character, this young woman Snow, maybe something similar to what we experienced with Izzy, maybe in different ways. But we're going to see the situation she's in, her being in the small town, her being from a particular family, the kind of friends that she has. When we see her at the very beginning, she doesn't seem to be the best individual, definitely not a role model for young women. But I think that therein lies this character's potential. We get to see her, I would hope, mature, grow, or we see more sides of her to where we are drawn to her and are able to empathize with her, whatever her situation is. Now, I'm just merely speculating. Again, we're only 2 issues in, but I do see some potential there with this character.
Yeah, and I think in looking at this series and thinking about my reaction to it, I feel like my reaction to it is entirely, idiosyncratic to me, because I actually feel the same way about the first arc of Southern Bastards, and I'm in the minority of people on that series. Everybody loves Southern Bastards, so this is more not this is not me kind of saying I think Azrael is a bad writer or anything like that. It's more of me saying this isn't for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Southern Bastards, and see if I'm almost putting my finger on where you're going here. There's something about that kind of redneck America, good old boyness that wears thin after a while. This kind of darker side of the American experience. Mm-hmm. I feel somewhat similar to you, I guess closer to you with Southern Bastards than I did when the first narrative arc came out. Because if you remember, Southern Bastards was one of my favorite of, 2014. But I have to tell you, after the first 4 issues or so, I didn't like it as much. It just seemed to be going in a direction that didn't excite me as much, or I didn't see it as anything necessarily new. So I'm not as bowled over by Southern Bastards as I initially was, and apparently by what most readers or how they're affected by that story. But I can see that connection that you just made between American Monster and Southern Bastards. Mm-hmm. Monsters and Bastards.
Yep. Yeah. So, and that the thing is, like, I really like the TV series Justified, which takes place in the same sort of milieu. But
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, but so I'm not completely averse to kind of I don't know what you call it, redneck noir or whatever. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah. So this is just me.
Yeah. Well, did you feel the same way about the last title for this week, and that is David Hine and Alberto Ponticelli's Second Sight?
Now, if I was going to try to rank all the series that we read here, I would probably put Second Sight right around in the middle. I think there's enough there for me to probably try to keep reading, but I wasn't as hooked as I was on, say, Replica or InSext or Strayer.
Because I liked Second Sight. I have to say this is one that I don't know if I want to call this my favorite of the 7, but it's definitely within the top 2 or 3, because I don't know which one I'd put at number 1. Maybe this one, who knows? This is interesting. We have 2 issues of this so far, Second Sight, and this is another fantastical narrative. Our protagonist is someone by the name of Ray Pilgrim, and he has some kind of ability. And how does he describe it? He uses a term at some point, and I can't remember what that is. He can't see into the future, but he can see what has happened in an ethereal manner. In other words, when he drinks some tea made with a certain kind of mushroom, and we learn this as part of the backstory in the first issue, right, then he can see something that has happened that is nowhere near him. So I think this first comes about, he has had this tea, and he's watching a news story about, a kidnapping? Mm-hmm. And he sees in his mind's eye, I guess, this with a second sight, who did it. And of course there's a murder. He goes to the police with this information, and he knows enough about the case to where the police think he was actually the one who committed the murder. Mm-hmm. And so, he's held as a suspect for a while, but then he has an alibi. And so the police officer wonders, how do you know about this? And you weren't there. You definitely have an alibi. You weren't the criminal. So the officer goes to him for other cases to see, even though he doesn't believe this extrasensory ability for Ray to kind of solve crime. But he can do that when he drinks this mushroom-laden tea.
Right.
Yep.
And he becomes a celebrity based on this ability.
Right, exactly. And I think this is one of the things I really like about this series, or at least what we see in the first 2 issues so far, and that is, all of what I just described takes place in the past. But now Ray has a daughter, and he also has a wife that he is now divorced and is not on the best of terms with. And his daughter has become almost maybe not a celebrity, but a celebrity wannabe in her own right when it comes to her own blog. So she keeps a blog that is kind of similar to the kind of crime fighting that Ray had at one point engaged in, to a certain degree kind of playing on her father's celebrity status, even though Ray is no longer in the game. And so when we get into this first issue, the setup of the relationship between Ray and his daughter, whom he's barred from seeing legally because of the ex-wife, putting a restraining order on Ray. But they do interact, and when they do, his daughter is trying to get him to drink some more of the tea and to get back in the game of solving some of these mysteries through his special powers. He doesn't want to do this. He also is unsure what she does as a blogger. I mean, because this is someone, as his friend who works in the bookstore with him tells him, you're definitely not anchored in the 21st century, because Ray doesn't really know what's going on with this blog thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's uncovered some information about something called the Wednesday Club, which is a powerful organization that may have been for years kidnapping children and abusing and murdering them.
Right.
And so that's how they come together, Ray and his daughter, to start investigating this. But meanwhile, Ray has problems of his own, and he's been reluctant over the past 20 years to re-engage with his powers.
Right.
Because something weird does go on with them, and we see little hints of that as well.
Yeah, and the little hints of this thing that's gone wrong with his powers come at the end of the first 2 issues.
Right.
And it involves, if you look at the cover of issue number 1, you see an image of Ray standing, it looks like he's standing in this pool of blood. And the reflective image of him in that blood is of a character in this leather suit with horns, with weird teeth. And it's this creature, or this character, or this outfit that we see at the end of issue 1 and then at the end of issue 2 as well. Mm-hmm. And at the end of issue 1, it seems to be that this is, or at least I got the impression that this is just another side of Ray. But then when we get to the end of issue 2, I got the impression that this isn't Ray. It's the guy who's supplying him with the mushroom tea. But, I mean, it's still not, I don't think the question is answered by the end of issue number 2. Mm-hmm. So, there's this question, who is this guy in leather?
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like we see these, the parts of the narrative where this guy appears come in dreams, in Ray's dreams, except for that part you mentioned in issue 2.
Right.
Now, I didn't get the sense that it was a possibility that it might be Al the chemist.
Oh, that's right. That's the guy who gives him the mushrooms.
Yeah,
Al the chemist.
Al the chemist, which is another. I don't know. That's sounds like something Brian Azzarello would do. The kind of pun that he would play with. But that it's more like whatever this figure is talking to Ray and taunting him. Part of the reason why he doesn't, or probably the main reason why he doesn't go back to using these powers, is because somehow they're connected with whatever this figure is. But yeah, I mean, I find Ray to be a character that I want to root for.
Right.
He makes some bad decisions as the book goes along, but it's kind of easy to see why he makes those decisions. Right. And it's clear that his daughter cares about him and despite the fact that there's this obstacle of the restraining order that her mother has placed. But so that relationship, I think, has a lot of potential, and I think Ray has a lot of potential for redemption, and I think that's where this series is probably heading.
Right.
And so so I think there's enough of a hook in this.
Yeah, and I think another reason why this is one of my top books of the 7 that we're looking at is this definitely does have that David Hine feel to it. I mean, there's no way that you can read these first 2 issues without thinking immediately of the tone of Strange Embrace.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think Alberto Ponticelli is a good match for this series as well as the artist.
I agree. Yeah.
I think he did some Hellblazer, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong there, but it does feel like he did do the Vertigo Unknown Soldier series. That may be what I was thinking of. I knew he had done a Vertigo book, and so so I think he's a good fit for this.
Well, we covered a lot of ground on this episode. We started off with Super Zero, written by Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti, with art by Raphael De La Torre. Then after that, Replica, Paul Jenkins and Andy Clark. Then we went on to InSext by Marguerite Bennett, with art by Ariella Cristantina. Then Dreaming Eagles by Garth Ennis and Simon Colby. Strayer, Justin Jordan and Juan Gedeon. American Monster, written by Brian Azzarello, with art by Juan Doe. And then we wrapped up with David Hine and Alberto Ponticelli's Second Sight.
That's right. And, just to kind of point a little bit to what we might see in the future of AfterShock, I know C2E2 is going on right now, and there's a big AfterShock presence there, and they, in fact, posted on Facebook not that long ago a kind of AfterShock family picture, and it included many of the creators whose works we've seen so far, but others whose works haven't either come out or been announced yet. And that includes writers like Mark Waid, Tim Seeley. Ray Fox's Jackpot is one that's coming out in the next month or so. Frank Barbary, Jim Starlin, Sam Keith, John Layman, Cullen Bunn, Tom Payer, and Alice Cott. There's some good writers that are going to be coming, and good artists too. They're going to be coming to work for AfterShock. So I'm really curious to see what those writers and artists contribute.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I mean, Dave Johnson, John Cassaday, Darwin Cook.
Well, they've done covers,
right? But still, the fact that they're getting all of these guys, I mean, this is something I think we hinted at the top of the show, but we really didn't go into much detail in terms of a discussion. One of the things that I think from the beginning, when we saw the solicits back in the fall of last year for AfterShock, this new publisher, is the sheer number of big-name creators, writers as well as artists, interior as well as cover artists, who they have gotten to do series for them. And I think that's very impressive for a new publisher such as this.
Right. And, these are creators who are working for other, have done independent, creator-owned stuff for other publishers as well. So it'll be interesting to see how AfterShock plays out, especially as it's, there's only so many series that a lot of these guys can do, So
right.
Are they kind of poaching series or talent that would be working for Image or, Dynamite or Boom, for example,
or Vertigo?
Yeah, or Vertigo, exactly. Are they going to be successful with that?
We're also, according to the publicity material we received, we're going to get encore projects from Marguerite Bennett, Paul Jenkins, and Garth Ennis. So these aren't the only series that these guys will be doing.
Yeah, this might be then maybe Garth Ennis's new home, for example, for his war stories.
Yeah, instead of Dynamite or
they've been at
Avatar.
They've been at
Avatar.
Vertigo, Dynamite, and Avatar.
Avatar, yeah. I was blanking on Avatar for some reason, but that's where he currently is. But and as we mentioned earlier, next month we're going to see #1 issues of Ray Fox and Marco Fela's Jackpot, Joe Pruitt and Simon Kudransky's, I think that's how Kudransky's Black Eyed Kids. And then Adam Glass and Patrick Olaf's Rough Riders. Mm-hmm. And I guess you can't go wrong with Teddy Roosevelt, right?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Too bad those issues weren't available, or at least preview issues by the time we did this recording. So, we had a good time talking about the new titles from a new publisher, AfterShock. We hope you enjoyed our discussion as well. And if you want to find great deals, especially bundles on AfterShock titles, you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. And if the past month or two is any indication, you're going to find some really good bundle deals with AfterShocks for the next several months. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our discussion of these new AfterShock titles, and if you do indeed like it when me and Andy disagree with one another. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. It's a very simple and easy process. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. And if you want to get a hold of us by email, we are 2guys at comicsalternative.com. And if you want to get a hold of us individually, and if you want to wish me a fond farewell as I leave this podcast after our heated disagreement that took place in this episode, you can write to me at Andy@comicsalternative.com.
Yeah, and if you want to say farewell to Andy who needs him, you can contact me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content of the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
It's all the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And we do want to hear from you. We'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.